Welcome to today's event, which is particularly pleasing because we are not only going to have an interesting discussion, I hope, but also a celebration of Kant's 300th anniversary. Kant remains remarkably relevant today. He has been labeled as the herald of the Enlightenment, as a cosmopolitan, and the architect of modern thought, and has brought to the fore the fundamental ideas of autonomy, peace, freedom, dignity. But just as many times as he has been mentioned alongside these ideas, he has also been forgotten along with his ideas. His writing on perpetual peace, for example, seems completely out of place during the two world wars. Yet the idea of the European Union or European integration is, on the other hand, very much shaped by the same essay. But even more importantly, Kant's critique of human knowledge not only provided the impetus for refounding the sciences, but also placed the assessment of morality, law, religion, and politics on a new footing. Today, in the short time we have, we will try to gain some insights with our guests into how this and other Kant's ideas are still relevant for our age. And the strategy is not to really focus on Kant the person, who has a bit of a, I would say, quirky character, but perhaps touch on some of his occasional autobiographical remarks. The world seems to still need Kant as a philosopher who has accustomed us to think that a free, just, and moral life is possible. And as today is his anniversary, which is usually accompanied by a dinner party, it makes the sense to follow his advice in handling of conversations, which are, of course, an integral part of dinner parties. For Kant, such conversations are namely, quoting him, a refreshing play of thoughts, which consists in discussing, firstly, the news of the day, this is the narration, followed by arguing back and forth, and finally ending with humor. And this is also roughly the framework of today's debate. And to do this at the highest level, we have two distinguished guests with us today, Professor Thomas Khurana from the University of Potsdam and Professor Zdravko from the University of Ljubljana, two of the most, I would say, insightful thinkers, but also critics of Kant's philosophy. Firstly, Professor Thomas Khurana, just to a short introduction, is a professor of philosophical anthropology and philosophy of spirit at the University of Potsdam and the head of Center for Post-Kantian Philosophy at the same university. He taught philosophy at numerous positions at the University of Essex, Goethe-University, University of Leipzig, Yale University, and the New School of Social Research. And his main areas of interest are ethics, aesthetics, social and political philosophy, German idealism, and other related topics on which he has written extensively. And he has, of course, also published and edited several books, and just to name a few, The Life of Freedom at 2017, Sense and Memory, 2007, and The Dispersion of a Conscious in 2002. Our other guest is Professor Kobe. He's a professor of classical German philosophy at University of Ljubljana. He has published the trilogy Automatum Transcendentale in 1995, 2001, and 2014, with a novel interpretation of Kant's theoretical philosophy, and the fourth book is the Three Studies in Kant's Practical Philosophy in 2008, and they were all published by Analecta, as well as publishing a number of other articles, especially on Kant, Hegel, but also on contemporary philosophy. He has also translated several classical philosophical works into Slovenian, including Kant's Critique of Pure Reason and Hegel's Science of Logic and Elements of Philosophy of Right. So it is a real honor to have you here, and judging from our debates before the event, I believe we will have an interesting discussion for the audience. So maybe for the beginning, let us start with a really minimalist question, a question about what you find interesting in Kant, or what concept or concepts, ideas, thoughts inspire you to reflect today. Okay. Maybe to begin with you, Professor.
You agree. Okay, the question is simple, and it's simple. It appears to be simple, and as such, it's suitable for tea table conversation that was practiced in Kant's time, because if I remember correctly, there is one other rule that he used to obey, and this is not to discuss any serious, because this is not good for digestion. So perhaps we will skip this one this time. Where his greatness lie? Well, the simple questions are usually those who are the most difficult to answer, because, you know, if you have the limited problem, let's say the split between empirical and transcendental I, this seems to be at least answerable. But to answer this kind of question, you have to reflect a lot. And I would say there are many possible answers. It's difficult to pick one. But I would say that the importance and his greatness is very much related to the fact that he lived in the intersection of the two worlds, that he saw the old metaphysical world dying, but was still, let's say, old enough to appreciate its greatness and wanted to reconstruct it under the fundamentally changed conditions. What I mean by that, I think that it is important to know that Kant was philosophically formed in the time of so-called school metaphysics, referring to Wolff, Baumgarten, Crucius, and the kind, who constructed a formidable philosophical system that included all regions of being, where more or less everything had its definite sufficient reason why it was so and not the other way round, including why there is something and not rather nothing. I think that in Kant's time, by the middle of the century, this formidable construction started to crumble. So the metaphysics, the metaphysical way of doing philosophy fell in a deep crisis of its conceptual apparatus. And the usual reaction to those who practiced philosophy at that time was basically to adapt to the new conditions. That means to change the way they were doing philosophy, to turn to the things not above the sensible, in the region of the pure reason, of the a priori, but to turn the gaze to the things of this world, both in subject matter and in the matter of presentation, because the philosopher developed a kind of, let's say, sense of humanity. They were becoming user-friendly. They became popular, even entertaining. And it's obvious that this is not something that would apply to Kant. But at the same time, this way of doing philosophy renounced as well the pretensions, the maximal pretensions that were typical of philosophy before. They renounced the philosophical rigor because they wanted to be close to the subject, close to the people, even, as I said, popular. Now, I think that Kant saw that the attacks on the traditional metaphysics were completely justified, and that there were no way of doing further philosophy in the way it was done before. But as a philosopher of the old profession, I think he stuck to the rigor and pretensions that were typical of the ehemalige Metaphysik. So, in a time of, let's say, diminished expectations that defined philosophy at that time, he wanted to keep to the old standards of rigorous thinking and insisted that metaphysics should have maximal pretensions and that metaphysics should be science. So, in a sense, his greatness stems from the fact that he was out of his time, that he was not modern. And to see again that he was not modern at the time he was writing his major works. It is enough to compare the literary philosophical production of that time, let's say from Mendelssohn, from Garve, even from Rousseau, Lambert, and many others, Tetens, and compare that to the way Kant composed his work, because his sentences are classical, basically translated from Latin, with all metaphysical gibberish, I would say, that was at that time not tasteful for the readers of the time. So definitely he was not modern, but precisely because he was behind his time, he was able to be ahead of it, I think. This was so in a time when the philosophy has more or less resigned to minimal task. He wanted to reconstruct philosophy in its former glory under the new conditions. And so I think that this is why he opened new paths. Of course, there is a question how to do it, how to think when there is no pre-given point of certainty, when the God is dead, in the sense that even if we still believe in him, he isn't able to perform the task that he used to perform in philosophy before, that is to serve as an ultimate container of the all possible answers. So the question is how to think where nothing is certain in advance. And I think that his answer, critical answer, would be to construct the points of certainty in or by thinking itself.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think I agree with this characterization. So I think it's very helpful to say that Kant is this transitional figure, and the way you were articulating this ambition to restore philosophy to its former glory. And I think that one conception or one central idea that was key in this endeavor and this attempt that Kant had was the concept of self-determination. So you were just also describing as the way in which we have to think for ourselves. So that is supposed to become the source of this new metaphysics, if you will. And so, I mean, that's also something I think that every one of us can connect to. So in our everyday lives, it's almost impossible not to want to be autonomous. So that's a central aspiration of our time. Everyone wants to be self-determined, independent, think for themselves, act on their own accord. And so in that regard, Kant has a lot to say to us. And what I find interesting about, and so this notion of self-determination, so what's interesting in Kant is that it's not limited just to the practical sphere, but it is the conception that integrates his whole philosophy. So in our theoretical approach to the world, recognizing, cognizing the world, as well as in our actions, we are supposed to be self-determined. And now what I find remarkable is that this conception that Kant develops of self-determination is one in which he tries to distinguish or bring out that self-determination does not have to be narcissistic or arbitrary. So self-determination does not mean that you do what you please or that you construct the world in every way you might want to. Self-determination is a quite different notion. If you think about the theoretical realm, I think that Kant does not want to suggest that self-determination means that we impose forms on the world with our understanding and make it like we want it to be. But rather, he means that in order to do justice to the world and to do justice to the things how we encounter them, we have to operate, become active ourselves in our thinking. So self-determination is a way of being receptive to the world. And in the practical realm, to be autonomous on Kant's account does not mean that we do whatever we please, but rather what he means by it is that we should act according to a maxim, that means to a general rule, which we can will to become a universal law. So not just a law for us, but for everyone else. So self-determination is something receptive, something in which we let the world come to us, and it's something universal, something where we do not make an exception for ourselves, but rather relate to everyone else. And so I think that this kind of understanding of self-determination is really unique and has kept us occupied for the last 250 years. I mean, trying to understand what this kind of autonomy requires of us. And so we could ask, how could we come up with such a receptive and universal kind of self-determination? And I think that another master concept of Kant comes in here. The only way to do this is by way of critique and by way of self-critique. So our reason can only be sure to be self-determining in this way, a receptive and universal way, by constantly criticizing itself and questioning itself. And so I think that this notion of self-determination is really one of the big inventions, or the way in which Kant has centered his whole philosophy around it. I think this is unique. Now, one further remark. So I think that Kant is also great in another respect, namely with regard to the fact that this notion of autonomy, as central as it is for us, is also raising problems for us. And Kant also helps us see these problems. And so if I think about this notion of autonomy for the contemporary time, I think there's a crisis of autonomy. So although each one of us wants to be autonomous, we can't quite shake the worry that autonomy has not liberated us, but in another way has maybe subjugated us or has tied us in a certain way. And you could say that there are three kinds of critique we could level at the concept of autonomy, three levels of a critique. There would be the subjective critique, firstly, meaning that to be self-determining or to be autonomous requires the subject to split into two, where one part of it is ruling over the other. Classically, in Kant, this would be the rule of reason over sensibility. So the worry is that autonomy might require that we actually self-subjugate ourselves. So it's not just liberating, but it also means that we become our own master, but then also our own slave. So that would be the subjective critique. There's, if you allow this very general term, there's an ecological critique of the concept of autonomy, suggesting that autonomy requires us to maintain a relation to nature that is of a dominating quality. So autonomy requires a relation to nature where we instrumentalize and dominate nature. And the world in which we live has taught us that doing so undermines the very conditions of possibility of further self-determination. And finally, there's the social critique of autonomy, suggesting that autonomy has not really liberated our relation to others and to ourselves, but is somehow a hidden and very effective mechanism of social control. So to engage us as autonomous subjects allows certain social structures to make us do what they want without even having the sense of being under the rule of someone else or something else. And so I think that in these three regards all show up in Kant, and Kant is really struggling with this, the way in which autonomy might include self-subjugation, the ways in which autonomy might involve the domination of nature, and the ways in which autonomy might become a mechanism of social control. And one of the really great things in Kant is that you always also find resources for getting out of this problem. And I think that the third critique has a wonderful new conception of freedom, namely aesthetic freedom, that contains a different notion of self-determination that tries to respond to these three critiques, the subjective, social, and ecological kind of critique. To put it briefly, self-determination is my answer. That's the source of Kant's greatness. But then also the depth with which he deals with it. So the ways in which he can also give us access to the problems of this idea, and then maybe resources of overcoming even these problems.
Hey, just another fourth element of critique, but a problem that probably relates to the subjective critique, namely the the call for autonomy can serve as a new means of subjugation. What it does bring with it is a heavy burden, I would say. Then before, let's say, before the time of the French Revolution, the society was stratified, and you might have deplored the fact that you were born on the position that you were born at, but it didn't depend on you. So you had your place in the society. Mm-hmm. With the French Revolution, with the égalité des conditions, you can become anything. It's up to you, it seems. And so you have a heavy burden, psychological and logical, to explain to yourself that while you could have become anything, you ended up like this. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is related also to the question of, you don't have a free space from autonomy. You have always to act as, let's say, universal subject that is subjugated to the demands of reason. And this is combined with the first call, very, very troublesome thing to do, a heavy burden for us that calls for a lot of psychological explanation, self-explanation. So what you're doing. And regarding the resources, the split of the subject, well, it's interesting that the split of the subject is not only the answer, it's not only the problem that opens up with the Kant notion of self-determination, implying two different instances. But in a sense, I would say it is a presupposition of actually doing morally. Because, the moral sense can rise, is generated only by the imperative that demands a total subjugation. That breaks, that's Kant's word, that breaks our arrogance. But in order, to be able to react to the categorical imperative, one has to be arrogant in the first place. So already split. The split is already the very condition of possibility of acting morally. So I think that you're right. There are always different levels of problems and resources offered by Kant to make and solve his problems.
Do you have something to add, or?
No, I think I agree. So I think that's very helpful. So in terms of the I think I agree there that was a great characterization. And in terms of, just in terms of the split, as you say, it's so layered, it's so differentiated. So the various ways in which the subject is being characterized as split. I was now just focusing on the way in which there is a certain element of self-subjugation or self-mastery that is also problematic. But there's all kinds of ways in which the subject is being split between an empirical and an intelligible self, between das Liebe selbst and das eigentliche selbst, and many other ways in which the I or the self is appearing in various different roles. And this complexity gives us a lot of room to move in and to find problematic forms of that split and other forms that are just the logical presupposition of any kind of self-relation, and then yet other figures of this split that help us get out of a relation of self-subjugation or self-mastery, self-domination.
Okay, well, in a sense, we are constructing a framework here, Kantian framework. I think almost all the concepts have been put on the table. I think just one is missing. I think Lenin was the one that said that that's the biggest problem with Kant is the thing in itself. Would you just shortly tell to the audience if that is the place where Kant is still relevant or actual, or is there something more to it? maybe in regards to the split subject, maybe in regards to some other aspect of Kant's thought.
Well, we entered the discussion with the recipes of good dish table talk, and the one was to add some humor in it. I heard a joke on Kant and thinking itself, and it goes like that. Kant met the thinking itself, and then someone asked him, well, how was it? And he answered, I would rather not talk about it. Well, the thinking itself, well, I think that basically is a problem that was constructed by Kant himself. And I would basically agree with Jacobi on this point, that within his framework, one cannot enter his system without the presupposition of a certain kind of affection that implies the existence of the thinking itself. But once one is in it, one accepts this proposition, one can no longer stay in his system. And I think, so the system itself, it's very unstable on that point. And this is, again, I would say, one of the productive points of Kant's philosophy, in the sense that he demands to develop it further. The question is whether it can be done in a way that remains basically within the Kantian broadly framework or not, or one has to quote another famous person who declared himself a post-Kantian philosopher. And why post-Kantian philosopher? Because he cannot raise the questions without Kant, but the relevant questions without Kant, but he cannot answer them by staying with Kant only. And I would say that this is true, and true in particular with the case of the thinker itself. But I think that there is a possible answer within Kantian framework, and I would say basically that it was provided by Jakob Sigismund Beck, which is one of my favorite post-Kantian philosophers. That was a philosopher that, thought in a manner that was clearly accessible to Kant himself, that remained within his presuppositions. And he basically expanded the notion of the transcendental synthesis under the concept, under the notion of the original representing. And I think that in this way, referring not to the, let's say, transcendent source of affection, when asking how to answer, how to justify the specific determination of our representations, but instead to refer to the very facticity of the knowing process of cognition. I think that this type of answer has the merit of remaining within the Kantian framework, but I would say solves the problem. So the good news for Kantian would be that one can remain Kantian even in face of the problem of the thinking itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I very much like this characterization that Kant introduces here, a problem that somehow points us beyond his own system, or something that he brings up that forces us to go beyond it. So I think that's quite true, that it definitely introduces an instability into his own thinking, and on the other hand is really central and vital for him and is needed as a critical notion. I think that that one distinction that I find really helpful and important in this regard is to look at the ways in which Kant thinks about the thing in itself from a theoretical point of view and a practical point of view. And I think that this is heavily underrated in the whole discussion. I mean, the typical, the main place that the concept is usually placed in the theoretical realm, where we think that we just have this idea that what we see of the world are just the appearances, and in order to make sense of those appearances, we assume a thing in itself that we cannot understand on its own terms, but that we only see the appearances of. And thereby suggesting that behind these appearances there's a second world of things in themselves, right? Now, if you look closely at the first critique, Kant is very clear that this notion of the thing in itself is a merely negative, critical notion. He does not suggest that he knows anything about it or could point you to something there. And I think that it's even the way in which he produces the concept is by using a grammatical difference between the appearance and what appears. If you have an appearance, you have something that appears. Necessarily, if there's an appearance, there's something behind the appearance, if you will. That doesn't mean there's a second world of things in itself that we don't know, that we cannot cognize, and so on. But it's a critical difference within the theoretical realm. And so that also means, and Kant is very clear that the thing in itself is a merely negative notion. You produce this notion by subtracting everything that you know of a thing, by virtue of its appearing. If you abstract from everything that you know of it, then there remains something that you can call X, and that's the thing in itself. So it's a theoretical construct. It's not, So I believe it's merely a theoretical construct, and has purely negative critical function. And now in the practical realm, the situation shifts. There are some beings that have an intelligible existence by virtue of the fact that they give laws to themselves. And there you have an intelligible world in the positive sense. But that's not a world behind the appearances. That's not a world behind the world. That is a world to come. So the world of practical beings, they are intelligible beings in the sense in which they stand under laws that they are supposed to realize in the sensible world. So in a certain sense, this notion of the thing in itself only makes room for freedom. That's its only task. It doesn't suggest that behind the things are some other things. I don't think this is true. And people always think that this is the way it works as a theoretical conception. But I think we need to see that in the theoretical realm, it's a purely negative notion. Only in the practical realm does it have a positive function.
Well, may I add, of course, there are different layers, different way of not pertaining to the world of appearances. One is the concept of thing in itself, the other is a nominal, and so on. But what I find interesting is that you refer to the introduction to the second critique of second edition of the Pure Reason, where Kant, so to say, retroactively adds some new explanation of what thing itself means, meaning that if there is an appearance, there has to be something that appears. And before you referred to the notion of to the third critique, to the aesthetical concepts that might solve the problems that arise in the first two critiques. That I find that quite interesting, and I would ask you what do you think about the suggestion of Schiller, who introduced the notion of independent shine, independent appearance. In this case, it would be the same, and he used basically the same, a similar argument, namely. He said something that, okay, the appearance is not at the level of the thing itself if it functions as appearance of something else. But if it isn't appearance of anything, it's just an appearance, and this is the aesthetic appearance, aesthetischer Schein, then you circumvent the problem of difference between pre-given thing and its appearance. Then you can construct the thing out of the movement of the appearance itself. And this is the way it probably functions functions in the practical philosophy. So I think that even with this notion of appearance, you can still drop the pre-given thing in itself and construct it out of the appearance. So the thing itself, not something beyond, but something that is being constructed in the empirical world.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I agree. So so my defense was to suggest it's a merely grammatical difference, so that we should revalue its status. What you say is interesting because it goes even one step further, suggesting that, well, if we have recognized this, then we can think about the grammar of appearance, and there are certain areas in which appearance actually works in a different manner. And I think that you're also quite right that, so the way I see it, so the first step that I wanted to make was to suggest, with regard to the practical domain, that in the practical domain, what's so interesting is, so even in the practical domain, when we read the groundwork, Kant says, well, we are inhabitants of two worlds, it seems, right? So we are beings that live in the empirical world under the laws of nature, but we are also intelligible beings. So somehow you could think, suggesting, well, oh, we are existing in another realm at the same time. So thankfully, we were also intelligible beings. But then if you look more closely, the intelligible world is only known to us through its law. And what does this law prescribe? To inform the sensible world with the form of the understanding. So the only way to realize this practical realm is by transforming the sensible world. It's not enough. So it's an unrealized intelligible existence that we have by just feeling the force of the law. And so this means we need to inhabit the realm of appearances in this way. We need to give a different form to it. And if it would be true that there are appearances that are their own manifestation, like you say in Schiller, then this would be exactly the right form, that the sensible world would need to take. And so that's very much in line with my own thoughts about the third critique, where I think that in the third critique we have kind of an aesthetic understanding of this practical task that you find in Kant.
So it means that I have not only one Kantian, post-Kantian philosopher, someone that thinks, develops Kantian position within the framework of Kant himself, the first being Jakob Sigismund Beck, but probably Schiller as well. I would agree.
Thank you. This, I think, is quite fascinating, but just not to go too deep into technicalities, I would just like to ask you, you already touched upon it, maybe just ask you, just to get to the more contemporary political topics, just to ask you both to maybe make a distinction, because everyone knows that Kant's critique, or the Kant is known for his critique, to make a distinction between his critique, or critique as it was used in his time, and criticism as it is used maybe in our contemporary times, just to make the floor a little bit more clean, in a sense, conceptually.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's another big question that you are raising for us, and it's hard not to get into technicalities about it, but I think it's a very deep, of course, heritage of Kant, this notion of critique, and to think about philosophy in the manner of critique. And as you say, so if we look at the three critiques, his big works, from his critical period, then there is, in a certain sense, there's a certain ambiguity of the program, or there's a certain kind of dynamic there. They advertise themselves in a certain sense as doing a proper critique or self-critique of reason in order to gain new foundations for metaphysics. So, in a certain sense, the way in which he describes it in the beginning, critique seems to be instrumental, or a temporary phase, let's say. Yeah? So you have to critique reason on its own terms to see what could it possibly know, in order to get a firm ground on which I can then decide So how do I decide between the various metaphysical positions? Yeah? And how do I construct my metaphysics? So critique is a temporary endeavor. It's a self-critique of reason to gain new foundations for knowledge. But of course, this kind of critical endeavor itself then gains a big dynamic and becomes like a processual kind of conception of self-critique that, in a sense, takes over. So the first simple indication of this is that Kant wants to write one critique of pure reason. That should give him the basis for new metaphysics. And he realizes, no, I need another one for practical reason. And then he thinks, no, I need a third one in order to bridge the gap between the first two critiques. So one critique produces the necessity for the next one. So it doesn't go as quickly. And so in a certain sense you could say, and then it goes so far that at the end of these three critiques, he still goes on to write a transition to the metaphysics of nature and actually a metaphysics of morals. He does that. But they are very much growing out of the critique itself. They are not understandable without it. So the critique is not a preliminary phase, just a prolegomenon to the metaphysics. It is the beginning of the metaphysics itself. The metaphysics itself becomes a mode of critique. So in that sense, you could say in the beginning, you could get the sense it's an instrumental, temporary thing, but then the mode of critique itself gets traction. And this fact that critique takes over, I think this very much then influences the following philosophical movements. So on the one hand, you have those who say, all right, okay, Kant did all these critiques, but now we really need to get the system right. Yeah? Fichte and Hegel, in a certain sense, you could say, where the focus gets more on the system, and critique is not the leading term anymore. But then on the other hand, you find others who are inspired by Kant's critical modality, by his capacity for self-critique, and try to adopt this. So make critique itself the source of intellectual discoveries and endeavors. And so, in that sense, I would say that that there is a way in which certain forms of criticism or critical philosophy grow out of Kant, just as the systematic philosophies on the other hand. So there's two lines that open up from Kant and two forms of heritage that can start from there. I mean, there's another question about critical theory, especially the German critical theory, in the way in which it is adapted to Kant. But that's, I think, gets more technical in a certain sense. So maybe I'll refrain from saying something about that.
Okay, I would just to add, yes, of course, at the beginning it was criticism against dogmatism, critical philosophy as a transitory phase in order to develop a pure system of philosophy. And I think that you're right, although there is a kind of discussion whether he sticked to the end to the original project to write a new metaphysics or not. I think that he let it go, and I think that it can be pinpointed precisely in his declaration against Fichte in 1799, where he basically uses the phrase of system der Kritik. So where critique turns out to be the system. But then I agree, we have three critiques, and I would say they are very much different from each other. If you start from critique of pure reason, or if you start from the critique of practical reason, or if you start from the critique of judgment, you have a very different take on the system of critical philosophy as a whole. But I would add another layer, and this is pre-critical layer. Namely, Kant used the Kritik der Vernunft already in his 60s in the announcement of his lectures for 65. And it's interesting that at that time he makes a close connection between the critique of taste and the critique of reason. So, and it shows that there is a structural homology between the way the works of art are assessed and self-critique of reason. Basically, at that time, he distinguished two types of knowledge. And first is where the knowledge of the rules makes their right application possible. And this is the case of the, let's say, logic and similar. And the other thing is where there are first the practice, use of the rules, and only by using them you can find out, you can formulate them explicitly. The interesting one is art. There is no general rules of art. You just observe the good artists and try to figure out what the rules might be. The other example that he uses is grammatic, so the language. You speak first and then you construct a grammar. And interestingly, and this is where it really gets interesting, is that the third field that he names in this way is reason. Metaphysical concepts are the concepts that we first use basically correctly to construct the experience, and only afterwards, only on base of this use, we can then make something like metaphysics. And I think that this is the most deep level of Kantian notion of the critique. And okay.
Okay. It seems that, in a sense, we are building a system here, and before we
You
were
are making us. Just
of course. But we were talking about something regarding the system. I'm just having a feeling that you're not really critical towards Kant, so maybe just a discussion on his system. Does he has a system? Is it coherent? Can we still use it? Yeah, of course.
Of course we can still use it, but as I said, the more incoherent, the more useful it is. And this is it. Because we said that he opened the questions without giving the definite answers, and this is why, starting with Kant, we must think further. I think that this is the best thing that can happen to a philosopher, to someone who wants to be a philosopher. And other things, since this is an event on his anniversary, it wouldn't be polite.
Yes, so I shall refrain from making any further comments.
Thank you to both of you for being polite to Kant on this day. Okay, let's get to business now. Maybe starting with a more timely subject. It is one of the, let's say, oldest dreams of mankind, especially in times of war. Namely, the realization of comprehensive or lasting peace. Already in Isaiah 2:4, we find the following words: "They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." So despite people's weariness of war and their constant desire for lasting peace, peace has never become a fundamental concept of philosophy. The great exception, as we have already mentioned, is Kant with his treatise on perpetual peace. And although Immanuel Kant once described his philosophical project as being driven by three questions: what can we know, what must I do, and what may I hope? Hope for eternal peace seems further away than ever, as it now seems to be almost a cynical plea. And if philosophy is its time expressed in thoughts, I would like to ask both of you whether our thinking is no longer capable of thinking peace, or whether peace has become unthinkable.
Should I? Thank you. Okay, I will. This is difficult but necessary question, I would say. Let me start with a remark. When I made an interview on occasion of 300th anniversary of Kant's birth, and it included some historical overview of his reception in Slovenia. And the interesting thing is that the first article written on Kant in Slovenian language, to my knowledge, was published by Aleš Ušeničnik and in 1919, and it was on perpetual peace. Of course, this was immediately after the First World War, and basically Ušeničnik there laments and basically accuses the Germans that they somehow disavowed, forgot Kant, because they didn't reflect on peace. That was not in their set of mind. So they were. He was shocked that Germans forgot Kant. But then it happened 20 years later again. They forgot Kant again. And I think that what is going now is that we, Germans and Europeans, are forgetting Kant again. Instead of striving for peace, the Germans and the Europeans have turned into warmongers. So this is not to say that I would support peace at any price. War is always bad, but it is not always the worst. So if you're attacked, of course, you have the only decent, normal, rational thing, if you have the courage, is to defend yourself. And the first obligation to all countries should be to support you in your defending yourself. But the war should be always fought, I think, in the prospect of peace. I think that if there is a alternative between perpetual war and perpetual peace, I think that perpetual war is self-contradictory. The war, as such, leads conceptually to peace, and that means that the war should be fought in the way that makes peace possible, and it should be fought with some idea of what the future peace should look like. Let us say, as a living of peaceful life that is not only the absence of war. And I think that that requires thinking. It's not enough to fight. You have to think as well of what kind of war or peace you are striving for. And I think that this is the problem we are facing now, that the thinking of peace, thinking of possible peace, is horribly lacking in our present situation. Europe is now effectively engaged in two wars. Foods on the grounds, I don't know, but in the way or the other, we are engaged and implicated. And it's interesting that the way we do it and the side we take aligned to in the both occasion is very different in both occasions. And I think that that severely undermines the credibility, the consistency of our discourse, and raises some serious question what we are doing, actually. What I find deeply disturbing is that there is no, let's say, political discussion, no public discussion in our political space. What is more, at least in the political discourse, there is almost a complete harmony of pushing for war, so that it has become virtually impossible to raise the prospect of peace. The irony is that, is that the current German Minister of Foreign Affairs comes from the Green Party. And so the situation is extremely strange. And I would say that if Europe stands for the, let's say, tradition of reflection, of thinking, of enlightenment, of public use of reason, then what the lack of public use of reason tell us about Europe? I would say that so if Europe stands for the tradition of enlightenment, of the public use of reason, and if there is no public use of reason on that occasion, that can only mean that Europe doesn't exist any longer. The other Kantian question would be how this is possible. What are the conditions of its possibility? And I would say that the answer would be actually the same, and that is that at least politically, on the political level, Europe doesn't exist any longer in the same sense. It's not a subject of international politics. And one last remark to that would be Kant referred to the way the French Revolution was accepted, viewed by the general European public. And he said, not in the actual partaking in the revolution, but in the widespread enthusiasm for the cause of the reason and freedom, historical sign. So the political elite in Europe was against the French Revolution, but the public was in favor. There was a split between the two. And I would say that the present situation is similar and the opposite at the same time. Namely, now it seems that the political elite is enthusiastic about the war. But the general public, nonetheless, doesn't share this enthusiasm. And perhaps this is also kind of historic sign. What kind of is a different question. But I think this is quite important. This is quite important.
Yeah. Maybe let me come from another side and then see whether how this relates to what just has been said. I mean, what I found very, very interesting and very inspiring in rereading Kant's text on war and peace in preparation for tonight. I mean, two features especially. So I think what's really distinctive about Kant is the ways in which his conception of peace is ambitious. So the classical schema of political philosophy, from the early modern schema that we have inherited, would always suggest a kind of a trade-off between freedom and security. So there's the natural freedom that everyone is equipped with, think of Hobbes, and then there is a certain need to limit these freedoms and these natural freedoms that we have in order to gain some level of security. So you have a certain kind of trade-off. Our freedoms are curtailed in a certain manner in order for us to be able to sustain ourselves, to not be exposed to the danger of imminent death, war of each against everyone, and for that purpose we curtail our freedom. But now, what is so striking about Kant is that his conception of peace means a certain kind of order of freedom. So it's not the case that we restrict certain freedoms in order to gain security. Rather, what he asks us to do, and he's following Rousseau there in a certain sense, is we should lose our natural freedom completely in a certain sense for freedom to be born in a different form, to gain another kind of freedom. And this other kind of freedom the true freedom that we could gain is one that we can only have in a peaceful condition. So it's not the case that, well, yeah, I have these freedoms and then I need some security as well. But no, without this kind of peace, freedom isn't real, isn't actually realized. Yeah? And so that I think it seems very ambitious to me in the sense in which this implies a double restriction. So freedom that is being won that requires the stifling of freedom, so that would require that no one can express their views and no one has any freedom of choice, that would not be a real peace. Yeah? It would be imposed, an imposed condition that looks peaceful but is not a truly peaceful condition. And so there are also some reflections that Kant then makes. If some imposed freedom where we have a kind of a despotic or totalitarian structure that kind of imposes this peace, in that condition he prefers war. Yeah? And so that's telling you something. So if a certain form of peace is necessary that stifles freedom, that's no real peace. But then on the other hand, it also means freedom as long as peace is not realized, as long as there is no peaceful way for our freedoms to coexist, we are not really free. We are just fooling ourselves into thinking we have some freedoms there. And so that, I think, is really ambitious concept that, as I said, puts us on the two restrictions. Yeah, we don't want to sacrifice our freedoms for a certain type of security, but on the other hand, our freedom is only truly real once we have attained a peaceful condition, and so sets a really high bar. Another feature that I find really interesting is that Kant is, although he is definitely an advocate of peace, and that's what distinguishes him, as you said, it's so interesting that he has all kinds of places for strife and struggle and even war. So a certain kind of strife and struggle is necessary. Think of his idea of the unsocial sociability that's necessary to develop all our capacities, and think of the various ways in, for example, on his account, virtue is ethische Gesinnung im Kampfe, so is only there in the struggle. So whenever a condition is reached that is fully at ease with itself, it's not quite what Kant wants. And very interesting, there's this, after writing Zum ewigen Frieden, he also writes another short text a year later that's related to the situation of philosophy. And there he starts by saying that philosophy makes us very prone to get into fights, to struggle, to debate, zanken, nicht nur disputieren, zanken. So we would quibble and struggle here, and even because it goes along with affects, want to go like it puts us in a position where we want to go to war. And he says, well, actually, that's a good thing. It keeps the spirits alive. It prevents us from rotting away. But of course, we should not go to war. And then he thinks about how could we contain this. Yeah? And so he has a sense for the irreducibility of struggle and Zwietracht and conflict, and that I appreciate. And so if you also look at the way in which he then describes the kind of peace that he wants, the peace that he wants is one that is supposed to enable our ability to be in conflict, to be of contrary opinions, and to be in a position where we can freely express them. And so that you could imagine a peace that involves this kind of strife or struggle, I think that's also a distinctive feature of his that I really appreciate. Where I find there is a certain kind of limitation in his conception is that I think that the way he thinks about peace is what could ensure such a situation where we can be in conflict or can be in difference from one another but still in a peaceful condition. Is his paradigm for it is the realm of law. So a legal kind of situation or constellation. And that's even true for his conception of philosophy, where he says, well, yes, how do we bring about this kind of peace between these warring factions and philosophy? We need the Gerichtshof der Vernunft. It needs to set the conditions, and then the kind of struggle can go on this basis. And it seems to me that I understand what he's saying, and with regard to international relations, probably the idea of the advancement of international law is the best thing we have. But the way in which Kant reflects on it, it seems to me that he's not sufficiently aware of the danger, of a danger there, of a certain way in which this kind of quasi-neutral framework of a excuse me, of a legal kind of setup is open to the danger of a certain kind of ideological cover-up. So it's possible that there, or it's not only possible, it's very likely there will be political asymmetries that will condition this neutrality. I mean, if you think about international law these days, the structure of the UN, the asymmetries that are part of it, you see how there is a political struggle going on and how the legal form somehow covers up or obfuscates a power, certain element of power that's still in play. And so it seems to me that thinking seriously of peace, we would need to think the political process that's needed there. And I understood Professor Kober also to be pointing in some sense into that direction, where he said, well, the problem about the EU, or how you were reflecting on the situations, you said the European Union is no more if there is no public use of reason there, if it's not even up for debate. So that we need, in order for true peace to come about, or to come about, we need a political process, not just, let's say, a quasi-neutral legal regulation of the situation. So I think that, at least that's my feeling, that there's a certain limitation here to Kant in the trust he has to a neutral, quasi-neutral medium. And it comes nicely out with regard to philosophy, where he then says, well, yes, so we don't need dogmatism, skepticism, moderatism. We need critical philosophy. This gives us the Gerichtshof der Vernunft. This gives us the common basis. And incidentally, it's his own position. So his own position is determining the court in which the claims need to be decided. And that's, well, there's some power play going on. Yeah.
May I add just something? I liked very much your stress on the fact that Kant thinks of peace differently, not in within the usual trade-offs. That he puts the relations, the decisive points, distributes them a little bit differently, and that can prove very productive as well. I think that this is really a strong reason to refer to go to read him again. And then you use the expression "the order of freedom," which is very nice again, because the freedom doesn't just takes place in a vacuum. It has to have certain infrastructure. And this is why I also find very insightful the way he quoted Frederick the Great. Resoniert ihr, wie ihr wollt, aber gehört. So that means that there is a internal relation between the free use of reason and subjugation, and the acknowledgement of the existing power structure. Meaning that, again, the free use of reason doesn't happen in a, let's say, empty space, but has its social, historical, political conditions of possibilities. I would, in this sense, make a comparison, a strange one, between the functioning of the free market and the public use of reason, which are both two public expressions, namely in the sense that the free market is usually conceived of, portrayed as something natural. Nothing is farther from the truth as that, because there are strict conditions of possibility that has to be implemented and often enforced by force to make it function. And something similar is the case with the public use of reason as well. And for that reason, we should always think of the implicit, inherent relation to the power structure. In saying that, we refer, of course, to Foucault, and perhaps also to his use of the notion of the critique that I find quite revealing, because at the end you mentioned a quasi-neutral framework of reason. And yes, there is, in the reason criticizing reason, in reason criticizing itself, there is always the question of where the reason stands while criticizing itself. What are the presuppositions of that? And from that very notion you can find two quite different Zweigen, direction of further development that basically go along with your previous distinction. And one would that be to make an emphasis on the practice of criticism, even without reason and against reason. And I think that this is basically Foucault's position, because he defined it as a stance of not wanting to be governed in that way at such price and something like that. And when he said that in his lecture in the French Society of Philosophy, there was an interesting follow-up question from the audience made by, I think, Jean-Louis Bruck, who was a Kantian philosopher, and he asked probably the crucial question, and that is this rebellious stance a fundamental, or are there certain criteria when the rebellion, when the critique is just? And the answer that was given by Foucault is interesting, because he basically wanted to evade the question, and he first said, no, I didn't opt for something, rebellion as a fundamental virtue. But then again he said, that doesn't mean that I'm against it. And I think that basically that was his position, because we have to remember that he had his Maoistic phase before, when he the Maoists used to quote, "On a toujours raison de se révolter." So the revolt is always justified. There are always reasons for revolt, for the critical stance. But while this seems to connect reason, the use of reason, and the critique, rebellion, revolt, I think functions the other way around. Because if you revolt, and you are always just in revolting, you don't need reason anymore. And this is what I find really dangerous, because in that case means I revolt, therefore I have right. I don't need the reason any longer. And this leads, I would say, to an impossible situation where every revolt is justified, even, let's say, the revolt of the supporters of Donald Trump, and so on. On the other hand, you have the other possibility. So reason is a dangerous companion. You cannot trust it too much. Our time is a time of critique, where anything must be subjected to, but I would say, from the rational point, meaning at least in the formal sense. So to conceive of reason not as a, let's say, reservoir of pre-given answers, where everything is clear, but with the intention to get an answer, a rational answer. So I would say that what stems from Kantian notion of the critique, in the difference to Foucault's, is the, let's say, this formality of reason, this pretension that is still upheld to the universal. And here I see very, very important divide. So yes, I would declare Kantian on that account.
Yes, as you should on his birthday, of course. But yeah, I think that would see. But I think that was very instructive and helpful. But I think that it would see the terms of debate slightly differently. So you were now suggesting that there are these two possibilities: a certain kind of relentless type of critique, but that just critiques for the sake of critique, or is just a permanent kind of revolt. Any revolt can find a reason. Any revolt is justified. So that introduces a certain kind of arbitrariness, and then we have another. The other position trying to maintain the position of a certain kind of rational type of critique, and you were explaining it in formal terms. So in order to make room for the various different kinds of situations that we could be in, and to also guard ourselves against certain misconceptions of these reasons, we need a certain formal setup. Yeah, and I think this option that you describe here, this kind of formalist response to the problem, that's very apt, and that's the right kind of response from a purely Kantian point of view. So if we are confronted with this, what I said, this kind of arrogation of neutrality that's not really true, and this formalizing seems like a good choice. But now I take it that Foucault, that's how I understand it, or many people also trying to fruitfully work with his material, so maybe Foucault's, we don't have to decide where he stands exactly, but people who do fruitful work with this, with his resources, I take it, don't opt for the permanent revolt kind of thing, where it's an arbitrary thing, or everything can be questioned. But I take it that the suggestion is that that the formalist response is not quite sufficient or convincing, but that we rather need to find the criteria, and we do need criteria. In order to find criteria, we have to always accept the concrete terms of the situation. That's why Foucault has only very slim notions that don't have much content, but they gain content only in historical analysis of a concrete kind of situation. And so you could say he is of the view that every revolt has its reason, but he means it seriously in the sense, not that he doesn't care for the reasons, but he wants to look for them and wants to see the concrete ones. And then once he has seen them, then he can decide, but only then. So that means that there is no formal ahistorical universal reason. There are various concrete embodied types of reason, and to get clear about them, we have to immerse ourselves in that historical material. But I don't take him to suggest there are no rationalistic criteria, but the criteria are immanent, historical, relative in that sense. So that's how I would see the...
Okay. We're not discussing Foucault, but I would just add something, that his the political decisions that he actually took, I would say, question the productivity of this kind of framework. And then what I find strange and unproductive in Foucault, so, okay, you might be right, but this is the question for Foucauldian to decide. But what I really find strange in his use of Kant, and he was one of those who in the later period were first to use Kant. Again, he was timely, because before the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution, there was a new development of the discourse of human rights and of Kant against Hegel and Marx and so on. But again, what I really find strange and hard to accept and hard to conceive is how he could first, in, let's say, structuralist phase, Le Monde, les choses, use Kant as a typical paradigmatic figure of the past system, and now, out of sudden, find out that he was basically very similar and close to Kant. I don't see the productivity, the reason for realignment with Kant, and this kind of, in my view, subversion of notion of critique. So why to refer to Kant from Foucaultian position? This is a strange thing to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it seems to me that in the order of things, Kant has a different role because he is exemplifying an episteme, so a whole constellation of knowledge, where Kant is, of course, a primary example in terms of that empirical transcendental doublet, but is still just a case in point of a broader structure. And as part of that broader structure, Foucault kind of rejects this whole episteme, or wants to say this reaches its end. But on another level, as a specific figure, Kant has certain things to say to Foucault that he has always held dearly. And I mean, Foucault, when writing, how is that, Folie et Raison, Wahnsinn und Gesellschaft, at the same time, he has to write, as another part of his examination, a commentary to the anthropology, which I find very, very interesting. And so I think that there is a hidden Kantianism in Foucault for a longer while. So that he's not just making up at the very, very last second, but I would rather say in the order of things, Kant has a more like a symptomatic function, whereas in other parts of his work, he finds some conceptual tool that he wants to hold on to. And so I see a stronger continuity there. But maybe we don't have to decide that tonight.
Maybe not. Just maybe a little bit of pushback. You already mentioned Kant's agreeing with the rule of war. One of his quotes, he says that real war, if it is waged with order and respect for civil rights, has something sublime about it. And the reason for this sublimity is particularly interesting. The sublime thing about war is that, like the forces of nature, it shows people the limits of their individual power and at the same time gives them the opportunity to preserve their moral integrity despite that. So starting from this Kantian premise, would it be possible to think of a war that had benefits for today's time even?
I think I agree with Professor Koh in the sense that we don't need any more warmongering at this very moment. So I don't think that we need to. So as I said, I appreciate the fact that Kant has a place for irreducible struggle and irreducible conflict, and I think that this elevates his conception of peace, because what he calls peace is not just, well, keep quiet, shut up, just remain calm, don't do anything anymore, but it's meant to give us the conditions of possibility for true conflict, and that I really appreciate. But I don't think that we need to ruminate about the sublimity of war at this moment.
Well, I think that sublimity of war entered the picture only in the event that you actually take part in it, from Kantian standpoint. And I think that the perversity of our present situation is that we are in the position of observers that support the efforts of wars. And that, I think that would be the last reason to support. So we have remained without the last resort to support a war, because there might be some sublimity in Kantian terms in war if you are ready to engage in one, if you are ready to fight one, so if you are prepared to risk your life. But to support the idea of war, well, the others are dying, well, this is perverse.
Completely agree. And a perfect segue to the next question. Kant, of course, is usually read as a prototypical German philosopher, arguing, of course, for these quintessential principles of reason, truth, universality. But the question is perhaps, why is he not read on these merits, but rather as a problematic or even an outdated thinker? Is this simply a result of perhaps a certain readings or interpretation, or is there something in Kant himself that seems to make him less suited to our contemporary debates or challenges?
So I'm not sure whether I agree with the diagnosis of your question, that Kant is generally perceived as being outdated or not telling us much. So I don't really have the impression, neither in academic philosophy, where he is a towering figure of the whole tradition and everyone returns to him, and still people describe their positions as either being Kantian or post-Kantian or anti-Kantian or something like that. So where Kant is even a point of reference that helps us orient in our philosophical landscape, nor in the public debate, in which I think many ideas of Kant still play a role, and he's a revered, in many contexts, a revered philosopher, and with people who have of a very traditional mindset on the one hand, but also people who think of themselves as critical theorists and try to relate that back to Kant. So someone identifying with Frankfurt School theory also has reason to point back to Kant. And so in that sense, I'm not sure whether he's really perceived as an outdated philosopher. I mean, one further comment. I mean, so the kind of opposition that you use is either we look at him as a universal philosopher that conveys to us some universal truth about the world or ourselves, or we think of him as a somehow historically indexed thinker that thereby can age and thereby become outdated. And it seems to me that we even have, and maybe that's something that's not being reflected upon enough, I think that we have reason to think that learning something from Kant, we should evade or we should escape this kind of alternative, but rather see the ways in which Kant's relation to his specific time can tell us something. So I mean, I don't think we have to turn Kant into some abstract, universal, abstract kind of mouthpiece of the universal in order to still learn something from him. But I think the ways in which he is situated in this complex way in which Professor Kobe told us in the beginning, this can tell us a lot, and I think does tell us a lot about our contemporary landscape of thought. And so maybe I'm just too much of a Kantian and don't want to see it. What the harsh truth that you are telling us that he's outdated, but I don't have that feeling. Yeah.
I would basically agree on that because if we let's say speak about the split between analytical and continental philosophy, where it starts in Kant. So Kant is part of the every decent philosophical tradition. He was always held in high esteem, perhaps for wrong reasons, because he was perhaps domesticated too much, made a kind of post-empiristic philosopher. But I think that we are lucky to have him as a kind of permanent figure. That even when he's portrayed as a, let's say, dull universalistic philosopher, there is still so much beneath that he's still engaging in many different ways. So I think that if we look back, the number of texts, the number of references, okay, today, if I'm not mistaken, Chancellor Schulz has given a talk on Kant. Is that right? Yes. I was told that way. So, okay, it's his birthday, but nonetheless, Kant is usually considered a good society. Mm-hmm. To the difference to some other philosophers.
Yeah.
Just perhaps the last two questions. One is just to get this outdatedness out of the way. Mm-hmm.
You have to go to dinner. Maybe one question.
Yeah, okay, one question packed into two questions. The question, of course, of outdatedness, and just a quick response, is, of course, aiming at his theory of race, theory of sexes, and theory of colonialism. So maybe just a quick response, but really quick, because we have this dinner party is real. It's not just made up. It is waiting for us. So sorry.
And a dinner party strictly following Kant's rules? Is
Yes,
that?
of course.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, well, let me try to say something on this. I think I really appreciate the fact that this has been discussed much more in the last couple of years, and that this also plays a big role now in the anniversary now. So the passages in which Kant, the sexist, racist passages, the passages in which he also defends colonialism. And what I just want to say is that for a number of years I had the sense that there was a certain kind of unfruitful divide. There were two possible kind of reactions to this problem that both meant you would not learn anything. So on the one hand you had people defending Kant's official works, the three critiques, in which you don't necessarily get the idea that it seems to be about the human being, each and one of us. There doesn't seem to be any kind of degradations in terms of, or differences in terms of sex or gender or race or anything. And so people defending his official writings and dismissing these comments, these passages as marginal. So we could keep on doing our Kantian philosophy without even engaging with this. I mean, I'm caricaturing now, but that's one possible response. The other response suggesting that by virtue of these passages that are, if you really look into them, are striking and troubling and really astounding, given the picture that we have of Kant, then the other kind of conclusion that was drawn was to suggest, well, you can see here now this whole philosophy is tainted. There needs to be some kind of immanent racism or sexism that's part of that universalism that Kant articulates. Both, as I said, both positions articulated in this extreme mean we become unable to learn anything. Yeah, so we either stop engaging with it or we continue to engage with it the way we did before. But what has now emerged, I think, in the last couple of years, I mean, of course, this had happened before, but it's becoming much more dominant now, is to look for the inner connections between these things, the ways in which his idea of freedom might lend itself to a racist inflection, to a sexist inflection. And once we do that, we start gaining new resources from Kant. We can learn something here. We can learn how I take it that we are very influenced by Kant, very influenced by the ideas of freedom, equal dignity, universality that he has articulated for us. But if it's true that you can think these concepts in such a way that they don't exclude racism or sexism, this is something we need to understand and know, because who tells us that we are not sexist, racist, in another way discriminatory right now in the way in which we understand universalism. So understanding how it can happen to Kant and how it can happen there can tell us something about how the kind of self-critique we need in order to articulate universalist conceptions in the right kind of way. And so my sense is that this is a really great thing, that this has become a more dominant kind of approach, and doing this is great. It enables us to engage even more deeply with Kant and to learn something from him, even in the bad. Yeah, and so I think that's really something that we should do.
Just because a short comment on that, Sean. I agree on that particular way of posing the question. If there is, the question is, and this is the question that should be asked, if there is a kind of structural similarity between his, let's say, derogatory treatment of different races and women and so on, and his concept in his philosophy as such, his concept of rational being, that could then show us that we ourselves might be racist and sexist in the way we use these concepts. So this is a necessary question, and it should include the fact that he conceived of rational being, finite rational being, in a way that allegedly encompasses not only humans and different races and different sexes, but the intelligent beings on other planets, not to mention the angels. But the question is the Martian or is the angel as a rational being somehow overdetermined by these biases? This is the right question. And just to add on what I really find blocking us, preventing us from discussing this question is moral indignation that is often accompanied with this kind of statements made by Kant. For instance, it was even in Kant's time already the notion of the concept of marriage as a contract between two persons for indefinite, open, free access to the sexual parts of the other. How could he do that? That's really unacceptable. However, we forget that until very recently, in fact, there was no possibility, conceptual possibility of intramarital rape. For instance, in Slovenia, it was introduced, the notion, the possibility that a rape could take place within a marriage the notion was introduced in 1977, and in Germany in 1979. So, you know, we were practicing for a long period of time the very notions that we were somehow astonished at when we read them in Kant. And I think that this moral indignation on these occasions somehow save us from the task of, let's say, putting ourselves under the question. And for that reason, yes, we might be in that position as well.
I agree. We relieve ourselves by means of these moral indignation, and that's misplaced, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, thank you both for this fascinating conversation. I think we will finish this here. And thank you all for coming. I would also like to thank Goethe-Institut in Ljubljana, University of Ljubljana, and the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory in Belgrade for organizing this event. And this was just the first event. There will be a couple of events this year, and the main event will be in November, a conference on Kant and his interpretation of war and peace. So you can already see that this is the first step in that direction. So thank you again, and I hope to see you soon in the next events.